The development of the Exactomat method as a new procedure for the elaborating process began in 1958. The old pressing technique gives rise to manifest defects such as the inevitable bite raise, tooth displacement, deformation of the gypsum model due to direct pressure on the flask, and alterations of the resin base caused by lack of shrinking compensation during polymerization. The idea is to eliminate those mistakes and also to make the process faster, safer and more effective. After 3 preceding stages in the manufacture of resin dentures, the impression record, bite registration and setting of the teeth, this last stage of the processing is at least as important as the others. The Exactomat technology adopts the injection principle. Pressure is exerted directly on the resin, not on the mold. The flask dimensions, the thickness of the compensation plate, the use of the decoblock support on the teeth, and the applied pressure are all adapted to the use of the common alabaster gypsum class 3. As for the investment, the hard gypsies class 1 and 2 are to be avoided absolutely, so as to prevent damage of the final product and of the flasks. The flasks have a number and can't be exchanged. A protective anti-corrosion spray guarantees their durability. There is a shallow flask half in which we lay a bottom plate that prevents the gypsum from flowing out during its conic finishing and facilitates the clearing of the flask after polymerization. The feeding button is fixed onto the flask rim with a turning movement. Mostly the little knob is turned to the inside. Next, the prosthesis is placed into a shallow flask half. The feeding button is taken away later after the elimination of the wax. In this way, a space is created from which 4 to 8% of the expanding resin can be sent back to the center of the flask during polymerization. The models are fitted into the matrix and ground to fit if necessary. For partial dentures with clasps, the clasps are detached and fixed into the gypsum of the decoblock core. Pro matrix, we mix 100 milliliters water with about 230 grams of common white elastic alabaster gypsum class 3. The gypsum mass must be creamy. The prosthesis is placed as closely as possible to the feeding button. All dentures are put into the flask after the inverted investment method. The investment gypsum is put up to the wax boards. The occlusion level is kept parallel to the flask edge as much as possible. For models of lower dentures, the bottom is filled up with alabaster gypsum. After the gypsum has dried, the wax channels are laid out. Mostly we lay only one channel, as for full upper and lower dentures, and for partial uppers and lowers, as well as for the injection of the soft resin molis. Channels always run from an injection mouth towards the right edge of the flask. For metal casts, a channel is laid to each of the individual saddles. All channels have 3 edges so that the flasks can easily be opened after polymerization. An exception is made for the injection of tooth protectors in the soft biomold. They need bigger channels with a diameter of 10 millimeters. After fixing the wax channels, we apply the red-colored insulator ready with a stiff painter's brush. The deco block is filled with a mixture of 50% alabaster gypsum class 3 and 50% of modeling gypsum class 2. We use for this about 45 milliliters of water and 90 grams of gypsum. With a brush, we first put some gypsum around the teeth, then we fill up the interdental spaces. Next, we put a little gypsum on the deco block, which then is pressed onto the prosthesis down to the teeth. Then the gypsum core is finished conically, so that after polymerization, the flask can be opened tension-free. Thanks to the free expansion of the gypsum core, no deformation of the wax form can be caused and cuspidal displacements are fully prevented. After hardening, the gypsum core is insulated with the red Vaseline ready for the second time. Now the compensation plate is applied between both flask halves. The numbers of both halves must be the same. The flask is screwed tight. To mold the patrix, we need about 100 milliliters of water for about 230 grams of alabaster gypsum. The flasks are put on a vibrator to facilitate the filling. It's advisable not to make the consistency too thick, so that the gypsum has an easy flow into the flask. After hardening of the gypsum, the bolts are removed. Then the flask is heated in boiling water for 6 minutes. It is opened, the wax is eliminated, the compensation plate and feeding button removed. Next, a thin vent is traced of maximum 2 millimeters diameter as an additional check on the filling process. After applying the usual insulating film on both matrix and patrix, we lay a sealing patch around the injection channel to prevent loss of pressure while the injection is in progress and during the polymerization. The flask can now be screwed tight with the teeth down. On the showing tab of the sealing patch, the kind of prosthesis inside the flask may be marked with a symbol. This is useful to determine the quantity of resin to be prepared and to make sure about the kind of prosthesis we are going to inject at the moment of the filling process itself. By bolting the flask, of course without a compensation plate, the complete gypsum mold is put under tension. This tension is necessary for the correct shrinking compensation during polymerization. At the same time, the articulation level is lowered with respect to the base model. The initial position of the teeth will be restored by the injection pressure, the polymerization pressure, and the difference of the expansion rates of gypsum and flask during polymerization.